Muito bem, nós iniciamos então as atividades.
We'll begin the activities with the panel 2030 Agenda, the role of subnational development banks. And so I'd like to announce our guests. Josué Tanaka, researcher at the London School of Economics, Sharon Spiegel, head of the Division of Analysis and Development of Policies of the Cabinet of Financing for Development of the Department of the UN for Economic and Social Affairs. Sebastian Treyer, director of the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations, France. And our moderator will be Sebastian Sommer, director of the Sustainable Brazilian Financial Projects, FibraS, GIZ. We also have cases of the National Development System with Sergio Gusmão, Suchodolski, president of the BDMG and president of the ABDE, and Leany, Lemos, president of the Extreme South Development Regional Bank. So with the floor, Sebastian Sommer. Good day.
Muito obrigado e bom dia a todas e todos. I was asked to speak in English. I think this will also help everybody, not only me. So welcome to this first panel of the day, the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, the role of subnational development banks. As was already said, my name is Sebastian. I work for GIZ, heading a project to promote green and sustainable finance in Brazil. And it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be moderating this panel today, not only because the topic could not be more recent, but also because it's relating to a very firm, a very close partnership that we as GIZ have together with ABDE on the implementation and inclusion of sustainability aspects into the work of the public development banks in Brazil. So we are very happy about this. Unfortunately, I cannot go into further detail, but we are looking forward to see the results of this joint work in the context of our project. As you know, or as you may know, trillions of investments are needed to finance the transition to a sustainable economy. Public finance alone is not enough to raise the required resources. National development banks have a crucial role to play in the mobilization of large-scale private capital. SDGs can be used as a valuable framework for targeting, financing, and measuring the success of public development banks in fulfilling their sustainability-related mandate. It is therefore to my great pleasure that the topic is so high on the agenda internationally as well as in Brazil. I feel privileged to be able to discuss with ABDE and its members institution about topics like blended finance instruments and the shift in approach from public development banks being cherry-picking financiers to a new era where development banks are also innovative market enablers. In the upcoming panel, as was already said, we try to mix insights from international best practices with real case implementation experience in Brazil. We have a really, really tight schedule, so I ask each speaker to stick to the agreed time. Otherwise, I will not shy away from using my moderator superpower and intervene. Without further ado, and I'm very happy that all of the speakers were already introduced by the moderator. Thank you very much for this. So without any further ado, I asked Josué Tanaka to share his experience in the first speech. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Bom dia a todos. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today and sending you very warm, although it's pretty cold over here, bom dia from London. To feel closer to Brazil, I have here a glass of suco de maracujá, but I want to reassure you without cachaça. So at least at this hour of the morning. Very good to be with you also on the role of subnational development banks in the context of the 2030 agenda. So given the breadth of the topic, I will look in this short intervention at one particular aspect of the 2030 agenda, because in my view, it has particular relevance to the role and contribution of subnational development banks. So my focus this morning with you is going to be on climate finance, and also linked to that on the role of cities, as this connects to most SDG themes, economics, environmental, financial, and social aspects, but also, as I will try to describe, to the role of subnational development banks. This, in my view, is particularly relevant because we're all into this very, very challenging period right now, and I think it's a period of great challenge actually to the achievements of the SDGs. And one of the big challenges that we all confront is not to lose on a lot of the progress that has been made to date, given the situation that we confront. It's clear in the short term that the first priority is to overcome the pandemic. It's also clear that following that, there will have to be a big emphasis on recovery. But also, I think it is very important that we use, and you hear that in all the expressions of green recovery, build back better, build the future better. There is also, I think, a big emphasis on trying to also, in that movement of recovery, to also position countries and the world on the path of long-term transformation to achieve net zero by 2050 in accordance with the Paris Agreement goals. Now, Sebastian did mention the amount of finance that's required. Okay, I could drown you with numbers, but I'm just going to take 3 examples. Energy, so electricity generation, storage, and network. We've just been doing a lot of work in this area in the last few weeks. Estimates, annual estimates of finance required, $1.5 to $1.6 trillion per year to 2030, of which 3/4 in emerging markets and developing economies. If you take energy efficiency in buildings, which is also a big area, $600 to $800 billion a year, of which 70% in emerging markets and developing economies. If you take urban sustainable infrastructure, estimate of about $1 trillion a year. So in this context, there are really 3 points that I wanted to make, and I hope, moderator, that I will respect the time so you don't have to use your superpowers. So first point is really the importance of domestic finance. Because you see, unfortunately, I've been away from Brazil for many, many years, so my view is more of a global view. But when you discuss climate finance globally, it tends to kind of always talk about cross-border flows, about international flows. But when you look at the actual global climate finance landscape, what you see actually is the majority of funding for climate is actually out, domestic, right? In which national and subnational development banks play a big role. By our estimates, something like 60% of the 215 billion in climate finance to 2018 was actually domestic. So that's the first point. It's a logic, of, let's say, the weight that domestic finance plays. The point here also that needs to be very much emphasized is local currency finance. Because if you look at climate projects, most of them, if not all of them, there are a few exceptions, renewable that exports a bit, across border, but most of it is local currency generation. And therefore, having the ability to finance in local currency is a very, very strong feature, and one, that is obviously a key feature of subnational development banks. Second point is a comment also looking global, local, on a comment on the international development finance architecture. So the point here, it's an obvious one, but needs to be said, is the role of sustainable development banks providing a powerful intermediation capacity between the global multilateral development banking system and local delivery. So granular knowledge of regional and local conditions, depth of local relationships allow subnational development banks to enhance the reach and the depth of international development finance at the local level. And the third point is really builds on the first 2 points, but is really then to emphasize, the role of cities, and the role of cities in achieving many of the SDG goals. And there again, I think that subnational development banks have a particular advantage. And I take there a good example here of BDMG, because I had, the chance to discuss this with Sergio in the past. And, I always remain quite impressed, if my memory is correct, that in Minas Gerais, I think there are over 800 municipalities, right? And thank you very much, shows I listen. But, there are over 800 municipalities, which really means that reaching that is very difficult, to do in a meaningful way based on real relationships. And I would say historical relationships, if you don't have that experience, that footprint, on the ground. So I think what I've tried in this short intervention is really to just highlight those 3 points. There are many others, but I don't want to exercise the superpowers. So I will now thank you very much for your attention. Time permitting, I'm ready to respond to any comment or questions you may have. And most importantly, at this time, I would like to wish you all good health, energy, because more than ever, subnational development banks have a crucial function to fulfill, making global objectives a local reality, and I think very importantly, bringing reality to global finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josué. Not only to stay within the time, even below the time, but also to give such an excellent framework and start in the discussion here and describe the, let's say, unique selling points of subnational development banks in the orchestra of development finance globally. Also, talking about orchestra, maybe we can use this remaining 2 minutes either giving it to somebody else or using it in the discussion, or to have like some drum and bass and whatever played with the drum set that I see in the background. Maybe we can decide about this later. But for now, thank you very much. Excellent start. I would like to hand over to our next international expert, that is Sharon Spiegel. And maybe she can also let us know a little bit about the different links and opportunities that subnational development banks have in using SDGs as a framework, in particular based on her experience, among others, in the work with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Sebastian. And I have my son's, not mine, the music studio is right over there. I thought of moving my whole computer there, and then we could have a orchestra in the background or a band in the background, but too complicated. So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start maybe taking a step back, as Sebastian suggested, and talking a little bit about some of the historical context for the Financing for Sustainable Development discussion. And along with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, there was, in 2015, there was this Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which provides a framework for thinking about how does one finance the SDGs. And it builds on what some of you might know or not, the 2002 Monterey Consensus, which was the first discussion on financing for development that was linked to the MDGs. And of course, the shift between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals was really there were many, but one of them was to bring in the environmental side of sustainable development, and how do you finance that as well. So the Addis Ababa Action Agenda added technology and environmental finance, as well as other things, to this framework in the Monterey Consensus. There are 7 action areas that we cover, which is domestic resource mobilization, private finance, development cooperation, trade, debt, systemic issues, the global financial stability, and technology. So we cover an enormous range of issues, and the idea is that financing is not really about the money, which is important. It's bigger than that. It's about the financing policies. One of the shifts from the Addis Ababa Action, from Monterey to the from 2002 really to 2015, let's think of it more in those terms than all these UN names and issues, is that in 2002, the idea was that if countries strengthen their enabling environments, the money should come. And so there was a lot of emphasis on strengthening the enabling environments. What we learned in the time between that is that while that is a prerequisite for countries and developing countries to attract financing, that it's not sufficient, and that especially in many of the areas we're thinking about in environmental finance, climate finance, et cetera, that money didn't come even when countries strengthened the enabling environment. So the idea actually of public development banks became a really important part of thinking about that space in between private finance and just fiscal spending. And so public development banks actually were an underlying part of thinking of the financing framework for the SDGs in the Addis agenda. And another part that was really also emphasized, which our colleague before just mentioned, was the issue of subnational, of the subnational level in particular, with regards to infrastructure investment, et cetera, to think about how that it's not just national, but we need to go drill down below national and think about financing on the subnational level. So I'm just going to quickly then talk about opportunities and challenges. We just published one of the things that I do is I lead a group of 60 UN agencies along with the IMF, World Bank, WTO, working closely with UNDP and UNCTAD on financing, on following up on this big, enormous agenda in these 7 action areas. And we just published our Financing for Sustainable Development report in 2021. And the conclusion is that due to COVID, there's a risk of a sharply diverging world and a lost decade for development. And that's in part due to fiscal pressures, limited fiscal pressures, and high debt in some countries, and how we have a diverging world now where some countries have easy access to financing and others it's incredibly expensive to borrow. The importance of, obviously, of access to vaccines and the need for immediate action and the hysteresis effects of some of the financial scarring that's happening right now, but then the importance of the need for long-term financing and infrastructure and social systems and et cetera to rebuild better, and that some countries just are going to find it very, very hard, despite the incredibly low global interest rates, to find that financing. And the question then is about how do we overcome some of those challenges, and that's what our report this year looks into. And there's a critical role for development banks. And I'm not going to go into the main roles of development banks, which you all know better than I do, in terms of long-term financing, countercyclical role, inclusive financing, and SME financing, et cetera. But I want to highlight two issues that have come up in the international discussions on the role of development banks, and then some of the challenges that come with that, including linking it to the SDGs. So the first is the debates on debt sustainability. The issue is that, as we know, the point of borrowing's not bad, and yet in many of the debt discussions, it becomes a bad thing. But borrowing is meant to lead to investment and growth. And in fact, even if it raises debt levels in the near term, it should improve debt sustainability in the long term if it leads to growth. The problem is that governments have what we would call income statements. They have the fiscal accounts. We see where the money goes, but they don't have balance sheets. We don't see the asset and liability side. We just see the short-term flows. So when you think about how debt sustainability analysis, they don't incorporate this idea of where is the money going. And so as a result, borrowing for long-term infrastructure investment is penalized just the way borrowing for wasting the money would be. And countries that are highly indebted that need investment to grow out of their debt are unable to borrow. So one of the recommendations in our report is for very, very long-term 50-year financing at very, very low interest rates from the multilateral development bank system. But another point that everyone has been talking about is looking at how development banks, because they ring fence assets and liabilities, if they can have a strong balance sheet that's sustainable, it doesn't have to be profit maximizing, but that can be financially sustainable, that because they ring fence assets and liabilities, can then be a place to leverage those balance sheets and to invest in and be able to borrow and invest in some of the needed investments, as well as Sebastian mentioned, working with the private sector and leveraging the private sector as well. So that's one point. And the second point is the importance, when you think about that, especially when thinking about leveraging the private sector, of using the appropriate instruments. So if you're going for financial sustainability, then you also need to think about, especially when supporting things like technology and innovation, of being able to share in the upside, and the importance of creating and using equity type instruments. They don't have to be direct equity, but links with equity instruments so that the development bank can share in potential future upsides to be able to stay financially sustainable. So now I'm just going to say very quickly 2 challenges so I don't run I think I have 3 minutes left. So one challenge is risk management, and I won't go into that again, but there are questions of how does one measure it? What does risk management mean for a development bank? The Basel standards penalize long-term investments, and they're meant for commercial banks, which don't have as long-term liabilities as development banks. So does it need to have a different type of standard in terms of thinking about risk management? And the second is the link to the SDGs. One of the biggest challenges that's happening, and the biggest discussions happening right now, is how do we measure impact? So when we talk about impact investment in the private sector, and we do a lot of work in this area, in my mind, and development banks are the original impact investors that are investing for developmental impacts, but also in most cases, depending on the funding structure, need to think about staying financially sustainable as well. And so for those MDBs, there's this question of how do you measure and think about and report on impact? So, and there are 2 particular issues, and I have 2 minutes, okay. So there are two issues that are happening in the global discussions in terms of thinking about impact. One of those issues is how sustainability risks impact financial returns. And that's really where much of the climate discussion has been so far. It's thinking about how does climate risk impact financial returns, and how do we disclose that so investors understand that. And that's really obviously critical to understand financial sustainability and bringing in those risks. The other side is even harder to think about, which is how does one's investment impact the sustainability and other factors in the SDGs. And these discussions are furthest along. So the externalities, both positive externalities and negative externalities. So positive externalities in terms of promoting sustainable development, and negative externalities in terms of carbon emissions, et cetera. And so this discussion, there's a lot of discussion going on now as to reporting frameworks, matrices to be able to report and understand and follow measuring impact. And we're farthest along in the climate space for obvious reasons, because climate is in the first category. Climate is impacting financial returns. And that's the real reason why climate is farthest along, because everybody is concerned with measuring climate to understand what is the financial returns. And the other SDGs, we are not nearly far along in terms of measuring and understanding how do we think about measuring impact. But there are many different efforts in this area. We in the UN work with a group called the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, which is working on building these matrices and trying to bring together the many, many different groups that are doing this right now. So, and then the final question is, are these the same? How would these differ from the private sector to the public sector and development bank sector? So, and I know that the MDB groups are thinking about some of this, but these are questions that I think will need to be answered if we want to really link the work of development banks for supporting the sustainable development and the SDGs. So I think I've used up all my time. The final thing I would just say is one of our big recommendations, and this goes with the speaker before as well, was the importance also of this network of development banks, of not thinking of just how do multilateral development banks learn from and work with national and subnational, and how then can we also use those for capacity development and sharing lessons learned between the different levels of development banks. So thank you, and I think I'm done with my time. I'm a minute over, so thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Shari, for this excellent input, very complementary to the first input, giving us this historical context also, why we are discussing about this, and also reminding us that when we are talking about SDG finance, sustainable finance, we are not talking about it because we are thinking it's an end in itself, but it is a mean to reach something, a development output in the end. And obviously you have reminded us also about very important challenges that we are facing including risk management, measurement, reporting, and so on. Very interesting, very relevant. You also mentioned some interesting ideas with respect to financial instruments that can be used by also subnational development banks, including equity instruments. Will be very interesting maybe to also hear from our two speakers as representatives from such institutions and how far they are able and how far they are already using such instruments in the case of Brazil. But now to finalize our international inputs, I would like to ask Sebastien Treyer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. I just tried to pronounce it a little bit different than my name, so we are not getting mixed up with all the Sebastians here. He is the executive director of the French think tank IDDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. And yeah, we are very keen to hear your input, Sebastien. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Muito obrigado. Bom dia a todos. I will speak in English. Of course, my Portuguese is very limited. And I'm very honored to be on the panel with Josué and Shari. What I want to account for is the idea that we've been studying at IDDRI, and my excellent colleague, Maria Alejandra Leany, is in the audience. She's been studying what aligning with Agenda 2030 might mean. The reasons why I'm mentioning aligning is really to say, as you quoted, Sebastian, the idea is that we need trillions to implement Agenda 2030, but actually there are trillions floating around the planet, and what we need to do is shift the trillions towards an alignment with Agenda 2030. And for the moment, we've been having that discussion of shifting trillions in terms of aligning with Paris Agreement. And for people, it seems a little bit complicated to think that we want to align with 17 objectives. But I think that's something that is already happening, and that's what I want to account for, that this reorientation of financial flows, if you want to align with the transformative nature of Agenda 2030, there are innovative practices that enable you to do that. And in particular, public development banks are exploring, innovating in that regard. Second point that is very important, this alignment with these 17 objectives is, of course, context-specific, nationally, locally specific. The transformation pathway to reach 2030 and 2050 goals is really depending on the specific historical, geographical, sociological context and political context, I would say, to see how you connect social, environmental, and economic goals in that transformation pathways, how you take into account of specific vulnerabilities. And that makes, of course, a lot of reason why national and subnational development banks can play a key role, and that's something that we have been studying. If they want to drive the transformation in territories to make it happen, they can do it. They are ideally positioned, but that means that they also need to align themselves with Agenda 2030. So in the study that Maria Alejandra has been coordinating, IDDRI has studied what is alignment in practice for these development banks. And I think please bear in mind that UNDP and OECD also have another group that has published lots of interesting things about how to align private investment, private sector with the Agenda 2030, and there are things that we have in common. So my first point is to say there are already, in the variety of national or subnational development banks that we have been studying, there are a variety of innovative practices from which we could learn. There could be a mutual learning process at all levels of the bank, meaning you have the overall strategy of the bank that can state a vision about aligning with Agenda 2030, but it's also the project cycles, its assessment, the evaluation that Shari has just ended up saying that this is an important point, project preparation and selection. You have the capacity to say what project is aligned or not with Agenda 2030, ex ante or ex post, but it's also portfolio management, building the pipeline of projects, defining sectorial strategies at the level of the bank on agri-food, on tourism, on these sectors. And it's also external engagement with a variety of players. And I think this is a very important idea that the banks can go, the subnational and national development banks can go beyond their traditional role. They support structural transformation to build sustainable societies. They are very well positioned because they are close to the necessities and challenges of the specific territories. They know the place-based priorities, and they can be a strategic portal to channel financial support to local communities, businesses, and entrepreneurs. But, and I will finish with that, we have identified at least 3 challenges or areas of progress on which we need to discuss a little bit in a way that is very, very converging with what Josué and Shari have been saying. The subnational development banks in particular, they're very close to the territorial level, but they face institutional and financial challenges. If they want to really implement the alignment with Agenda 2030 as a whole of a bank approach and an ecosystem approach with the rest of the territory. So whole of a bank and ecosystem approach are 2 main points. How to do that? What are the limiting factors? First point, there are weaknesses in local markets. Acting in local currency is also a challenge. And that's why we believe, something that has been already said, the role of MDBs in support of national and subnational development banks is extremely important to create investment opportunities, to help seek out new partners, build the capacity of suitable partners. That's not necessarily the SDBs that can do that on their own, to try and shape the investment pipeline, bring deals to the market, and also tap and develop local capital markets. These are all points where MDBs and national and subnational work together. Second point and challenge, the SDBs can be bridges, local anchors, articulators, convening key public and private actors around sustainable development priorities. They can invest in non-traditional sectors or in poor or problematic settings. But for that, they need political backing and support from governments, and also from their shareholders, of course, but also from other international players. I would say donors, other donors, NGOs, credit rating agencies as a key element of what we need also to look at, research institutions and the international scientific community, because all what we are saying about aligning with Agenda 2030 is going to be extremely knowledge intensive. And so that's a whole ecosystem at different scale that need to support, to help having a political backing and the support for the sustainable, so the subnational development banks to develop their capacity. My third point is actually Shari's conclusion. We need to act as a system across scale and not just declare that this scale matters, but see exactly as Shari was saying, what are the links that we need to build between the scales. I've been talking about some of them. I think the one point that is crucial in the link between the different levels is the issue of having a national vision that helps articulate or make the link between the different levels. What I mean by that is a clear SDG or Agenda 2030 oriented national policies and budget, a public budget. And that's exactly the point of these very important, to us, very important INFFs, so the integrated national financing frameworks that are at the heart of Addis Abeba's implementation agenda. These are the cornerstone of that collaboration between subnational, national, and global players. And that, I think, is something that we need to continue pushing for. The whole variety of players that I've mentioned, research, NGOs, civil society, governments, local or national, they could all help make a consistent build up consistent INFFs, and that's probably something that will help policy development, building the pipelines of projects, etc. Last point in that idea of acting as a system is, of course, what are the types of financial regulations that will help the banks take the risks that they need to take without infringing on the necessary regulations. And I think that's something that Shari is much more a specialist of than I am, but that she mentioned also, I hope I'm not mistaken, about how the Basel regulations, what is the specificity of these public development banks. And then we also have a specific discussion on subnational development banks. Do they have specific requirements? So that's where I'm leaving the floor. Just I think it's very useful that this conversation about the practice of development banks and how they align with Agenda 2030, that needs a mutual learning process. And I think we've been with Sergio Gusmão in clubs of public development banks at various scales, global, Latin American, Brazilian, and I think that's exactly what we need to have these mutual learning processes at the different scales. So this forum is extremely important in that regard.
Thank you very much, Sebastien. And you make my life so easy, not with respect to timekeeping, but also with respect to the content. Very interesting content of this panel, all inputs very complementary to each other. Thank you very much for reminding us about the importance of shifting the trillions and also the advantages of SDGs that can be used as a comprehensive framework and the ideal positioning of the subnational development banks for applying them. Also very interesting that you mention, similar to Shari, some new roles that subnational development banks can take and play, including also engagement and building the pipeline, for example, which I think links very good to my introductory remarks in this shifting the approach from a sole financier that uses this ideal positioning as an advantage for the institution, shift towards an institution that is really opening up new markets. Thanks also for the challenges that you have posted. Maybe our next panelists can pick this up also, that you have mentioned the systematic approach that it needs, and probably also one requirement for having this systematic approach between the different international and national partners is to have a joint language, to know what we want to achieve, to have the same objectives. And I think there also the topic of this panel, the SDGs, can be used as an orientation. But now we will hear from the practice, on the ground application experience from not only the two largest subnational development banks in Brazil, but also, as far as I know, also two very good examples of banks that already use the SDGs as an orientation for their work. So first, I would like to open the floor, hand over to Leany Lemos. Leany is the president of the Regional Development Bank of the Extreme South, BRDE. And Leany, the floor is yours.
Obrigada, Sebastian. Obrigada, Sergio, ABDE, pelo convite participar.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, ABDE, for the invitation to participate here in this forum. And thank you all, Shari and Josué, for the excellent insights. And BNDR is the largest development bank in Brazil. We work in 3 states and in 1,087 municipalities. We were established 6 years ago, and we support many projects, obviously large ones, but at this time of pandemics, we are also working in projects to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. We changed in the last 5 years. We are no longer just a transferer of resources from BNDES, which is the large national foment bank that was important to consolidate the system, but obviously sustainability and autonomy is very important in the long term so that we can feed our projects, regional and local projects, in a more sustainable manner. In addition to diversifying funding in the last 5 years, and we are doing that with multilateral agencies in France and May and CAF and World Bank and IDDRI and many KfW, many partners, so that we have sustainability. And also, we had last year, we started a pilot for a capital markets issuance. It is incipient, but the idea is to go forward. And Sergio, you have a lot to talk about that, but we're also learning with him. It is excellent. We're going to have a partnership signed next week, but also to issue sustainable bonds. And it is also very important to us. Now, going to the 2030 agenda, it is important to talk about the projects we have underway and our challenges. As a public bank, a development bank, we need to generate economic development and also to support public policy. So the 2030 couples well with our mission, which is already focused on people, the prosperity, and the planet. So in addition to other projects, we have some examples of those that are aligned with SDGs. It is important to say that we have the targets. Shari, we have that. It is a challenge to measure the impact of projects, the adherence to SDGs, but also the final impact. But 83% of the projects adhere somehow to ODS, to SDGs, I beg your pardon. We have a very large agricultural portfolio. We are in Brazil, in the national and exporting agro sector, but we also have a low carbon agriculture project.
It's the program that has most grown in the past few years, representing about 20% of all our contracts. In terms of contracted volume, 80% in renewable energy and energy efficiency, but we also have renewable use of water and low carbon agriculture. This is something that's been growing, especially on the energy side. There's also another important characteristic, which is related to the form or mode of production. So we have credit cooperatives, we have production cooperatives, and the biggest clients of the bank are cooperatives. So we have a wine cooperative in the wine sector, and in grain production, in milk production, and agro industry. So cooperatives that add other smaller cooperatives. And so this is a very specific characteristic of the country, of the South. And we have actions with credit cooperatives. Increasingly, last year and this year, the role of cooperatives and associates has been very important for us to reach micro and small companies. So sustainable financing, sustainable consumption, adherence to SDGs and sustainability, these are the challenges for the future. I'd like to end here. Sebastian, I hope I have provided interesting inputs from our bank that is trying very hard to adhere to the SDGs.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leany. Yes, indeed, very interesting insights. Also, thanks for mentioning, let's say, the white elephant in the room, BNDES, and your challenge, I think, that you are sharing with the majority of other ABDE members is of diversifying now your funding base. And also thank you for telling us a little bit how you are adapting also on your product side. Last but definitely not least, I invite Sergio Gusmão to speak to us. Sergio is not only the president of the Development Bank of Minas Gerais, BDMG, but also the president of ABDE, the hosting institution today. Sergio, over to you.
Obrigado, Herr Sommer, que também é nosso parceiro.
Thank you. Thank you. Sebastian is also our partner on the financial innovation side and also other initiatives. I'd like to greet my colleagues of this panel, Shari, Sebastian, Leany, and I feel I'm in a classroom because I'm noting down all the ideas and references and concepts that are so stimulating, and also the design of strategies for our operations. This panel has these very interesting complementary aspects. So on the one side, diagnostic and lessons learned from different generations of international agendas, as Shari mentioned, and also the Millennium Goals, the MDGs, and the Monterrey and agenda, the Addis Ababa agenda, the financing of the 2030 agenda, lessons learned in this 15-year interval. And we start addressing strategies with Josué. Josué, who for so many decades was a central part of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a very interesting bank because it was supposed to be extinct, but it reinvented itself and has been helping the Eastern European countries in the transition and integration with the European Union, expanding actions towards the Mediterranean countries, and now directly involved in the financing of the Belt and Road project and integration between Europe and Central Asia and Far East also, with the expansion and entry of new members such as India. And so those who work with development financing, even here in Minas Gerais, we need to expand our horizons and look at experiences of other regions that might be far away, but there are similarities with what we are doing here with our own reality. Lastly, the topic that is most important for us here is execution and implementation of these agendas and mandates in the last mile. So in this sense, I am speaking on this panel as president of the Minas Gerais Development Bank, but ABDE can give an example to other partners in Latin America and other regions, insofar as we operate at a subnational level, not only in Brazil, but not only Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, Africa, even the US with the California Development Bank, and even Germany with its development banks in each state, has this operation that is very relevant at the subnational level. And it's important to also, regarding implementation of the SDGs, and we are in the last decade of action, coming close to 2030. And so a recent OECD study reveals that 65% of the 169 SDG targets demand coordination with local and regional governments in order to be implemented. Therefore, the importance of subnational development banks, but also national development banks in smaller countries with a portfolio, with a focus on regions and territories, and extreme relevance, not only in this pandemic, in cyclic and anti-cyclic, counter-cyclic measures, culminating in the deepening of the portfolio of sustainable development linked to several SDGs, both on the social and environmental sides. Shari mentioned a very important topic that I'd like to comment, which is monitoring and reporting of what is being done. Why is this so important? It's important not only for raising resources, as we recently did with the first issuance of a green bond, but also by reporting to stakeholders, we inform our strategies. We can conduct an evaluation and assessment, and we can update our strategies and business plans, which are annual or 5-year plans, so that we can improve our performance and effectiveness in delivery on the ground, so we are able to implement these major agreements negotiated in Washington, in Geneva, in the big centers, and we go to small 5,000 inhabitant cities with concrete projects that are monitored, assessed, and in a second or next financing experience, these projects will be improved from an economic point of view and even in terms of the engineering and technology. We've been doing this, for instance, municipal financing that Josué mentioned. People live in cities. Our banks have important portfolios with municipalities. So it's a topic that I wanted to address. And to conclude, we work in a network. We are not alone. Leany just mentioned the bilateral agreement we are going to sign, the two banks. We recently launched with the support of the French Development Agency, and also we launched an alliance of subnational development banks of Latin America and the Caribbean with more than 240 participants of development financial institutions from all over Latin America. And so this exchange of knowledge, even the smaller ones, we are all knowledge institutions, and this is very important for us to mobilize resources in a cascading fashion from multilateral to subnational and implementing projects efficiently. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you very much, Sergio.
Muito obrigado.
Also to remind us how to transfer these big global and general goals to specific local projects, and to also remind us that with other large development banks, including EBRD, it is possible to have this shift of approach over time as your objectives, as your mandate, as your surrounding frameworks are changing. As always, with such interesting panels, with so many people that have a possibility to speak, we are running out of time. What a surprise. Hence, I would ask probably each of the international speakers to just give a final remark, maybe also relating a little bit to the two practical inputs that we have received. So really just in 1 minute, and maybe we start the other way around in terms of sequence, starting with Sebastien. Yeah, so just a final remark from your side, please.
My final remark is really that I think we can learn a lot, for instance, in Europe from what is happening in Brazil. And that's something that is about the mutual learning process that I wanted to talk about. What BDMG and BRDE are doing is extremely useful for us to have a conversation in Germany, France, and Italy. Not to say that we want to have the same type of banks, but that your practices and innovations are going to be are innovative enough and really innovative in a way that we want to be able to also bring those lessons back. So thanks for the invitation. I hope to invite you back for discussion in Europe.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and maybe also at some point back in person to discuss and not online. Shari, your final remarks, please.
Thank you so much. So I also really am listening and to the innovations and how much one can learn from, and how much we need, especially those of us who work on the global level, need to learn from what the experiments and ideas happening on the local level, and also to share those with other countries that are in earlier stages of development. I was particularly interested in the comments about the cooperatives that you're working with. It's something that Germany actually has a very well developed system of, and it would be really interesting to better understand similarities and differences, what works and doesn't work, and what, again, from my side, what that means for other countries. And as part of my job in thinking about what countries can learn from each other. And we also work very closely on this project on integrated national financing frameworks that was mentioned earlier. And one of the main points in that is really to try to learn from experiences that different countries are having and find ways to share those with other countries to learn. So thank you so much, and I've learned a lot, so thanks.
Thank you very much, Shari. Last but not least, drums. Josué, please, your final remarks.
Okay, I will leave the samba for later together with, I finished my passion for judo, but once I get to the cachaça part, I play a bit of samba here. No, look, I think my comment would just be linked to the final observation I made, and also to having listened, to all the fellow panelists. So just to connect the two, I think, the point I was making was really the crucial function that subnational development banks play, I would say, to one, connect reality to global finance, and that fits with many of the points that have been made, about experience, about innovation, and, being a half Brazilian myself, I know that that's a nature of Brazil, is, the famous word, right? Jeito or jeitinho. You find ways, often to deal with very difficult situations. And that is something definitely that's good, for the world to benefit from, right? So that's one movement, right? And I think the other movement, which is in a way making global objectives a local reality, really fits then with what I would call the alignment issue, which also Shari, and Sebastien also mentioned. This notion that, what is the frame, both to decide objectives and at the same time to execute and to be able, and I think there was a point that Sergio mentioned about, monitoring and seeing, what the results are. So to conclude, I think there was this sentence that said, I think it was Shari mentioned that development banks were, the original impact investor. And that applies definitely, to subnational development banks. And that's how we need to keep on working together on that for impact, because that's what will make the difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Josué. Once again, thank you to all panelists and speakers here. I can only agree to what you have said. It was really an enlightening a panel and a very enriching discussion. Thank you very much also for the honor to moderate this. I give back to the organizers and wish everybody a very successful next sessions and interesting debates. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.